This time we're going to repaint this little dragon pot. A friend of mine bought me this a few years ago and I use it to keep all of my paintbrushes and bits and bobs in while I'm working. You might have seen it in the background on a couple of the painting videos. You need a few paints on this one. I'm starting from a white primer, then I am using a gold mirror finish paint, and I'll be sealing all this in with some satin clear varnish just to give us a decent base coat to work from for the next stage. We're back in from outside where we sprayed this with the white primer, then gave it a coat of the mirror gold, and to seal that all in, a coat of the satin varnish. This serves two purposes. The gold is quite fragile and picks up finger marks really easily. It's also very, very shiny, so paint won't stick to it. The varnish protects against the first thing and gives you a decent surface to paint to for the second thing. To begin, you want some corn red from Citadel. Paints I'm using here are basically going to be Citadel paints throughout, I think. And using a reasonably sized brush, you want to start picking out the areas that you want to be red. Now, quite a lot of the gold on this I'm using as a base coat for the scales and some of the design work. But I want most of his body to actually be this nice dark red colour. There's not really a quick way to do this. You just have to take your time, fill in the areas where you want the colour, and just be careful around your gold edges, because of course if you paint over the gold you can't go back and touch it up very easily with it being sprayed on from an aerosol. But the details on this are fairly chunky, so you shouldn't have too many problems there. This paint behaved very well for me. It's one of my favourite of Citadel's paints. Coverage is excellent on corn red, and it's very predictable in the way that it actually goes on. However, if you find that it's not quite going into some of the deeper details, add just a tiny bit of water to the paint on your palette and it will just flow a little bit better into those recesses for you. A little while later and we are all done with the areas I want red. This is quite a heavily carved model. The details are very pronounced, so you can already see the light from my lamp is doing quite a lot of the work. But we're going to improve that. You'll need some Carroburg Crimson. This is a really nice sort of burgundy colour. It's sort of halfway between a purple and a very dark red. It works exceptionally well over these very dark reds, so you don't shift the colour too far from where you started, and it's an excellent base for the highlights that we'll do later. I'm using quite a large flat brush here. I find this just a little bit easier to control and prevent me from putting the wash onto the gold, which I don't want at this stage. And it allows me to flood a lot of the area very quickly. With this having all these little scales and details, you want to make sure the wash is actually getting in everywhere, but you're also going to have to keep an eye on how it pools, because you don't want to overload an area with too much. Now, because of the size of this miniature being much larger than I usually work with, I suppose technically it's a miniature, it will take quite a while for this to dry. Here we are, sometime later, and all of that wash is dried. It's got a slightly matte finish to it, so it takes a lot of that shine off. And now we're going to use some Nuln Oil. This stuff's just talent in a bottle, it really is. I'm using the Nuln Oil on the pot section of this. It's sculpted so the dragon looks like he's bursting out of a pot made of something. And you have to wait for the Carroburg Crimson to dry first, because you don't want these two bleeding together, and it can take quite a while. If you use a hairdryer on low, you can speed it up just a little bit, but be careful, you don't want to be pushing the wash in areas that you don't want it. I'm only doing the pot because I want a different gold finish on the pot than I do on the dragon. So again, just be careful around your edges. These flat chisel tip brushes are great for this sort of job. some time later and it's dry, it just looks sort of dirty at this point. We're using some Agrax Earthshade now that the pot has dried, and we're going to use that on the gold of the dragon. This will help make the gold on the dragon stand out as a different material, and it will also blend with the red tones of the scales a bit nicer. So it will give you that sort of very subtle visual clue that there are two items here. It doesn't matter as much if this wash goes on the areas that you've done with the Caribou Crimson and the Nuln Oil. It won't show up as badly, but still take care. It's always best to get the cleanest finish you can on this sort of a project. We are. That's all dried. You can see how everything's starting to look a bit dirty and a bit dingy now with the washes going on. Don't worry, you have to trust the process. Our next paint is Sycorax Bronze. This is another one of my favourites from Citadel. We're using the layer version. I think this one has a base version as well, and I'm using a dry brush from Army Painter. This was a new gift from Pat. I've been after some big soft dry brushes for projects just like this. These brushes are amazing. I'm not sponsored, they're just really nice to use. Make sure that you wipe most of the paint off on your cloth or whatever surface you're using. I'm using some kitchen towel here, and then very lightly just kind of sweep the brush over your surfaces. You don't want to get full coverage here, you're just looking to catch the edges and the higher points. All finished, ready for the next stage, and that's going to be some Runefang steel. This is very similar to the old mithril silver that Games Workshop used to do. It's not quite the same, but it's very close. Dry brushing again on this one, and we're going to highlight less areas than we did before. So you want to be focusing on the lip of the pot and the edges of that knotwork design that's on there, anywhere where the light's going to catch it more obviously. So you want quite a light touch here. The problem with highlighting metallics in this way as well is sometimes you can't really see what you're doing, because with them being true metallic, the light that you're working under gives more reflections and sometimes hides what you're doing. So you sort of just have to trust that you've got an area when you've done it. You can always go back and correct later if you need to. It can be quite difficult to see this on camera too. It's subtle at this stage. All done, you can just see the hint of it. Our next is Balthazar Gold. This is another excellent metallics. The metallics Games Workshop have been producing lately have been really very good. The coverage is excellent, the range of tones is excellent, and they're some of my favourites. We're going in with a brush and picking out very carefully the recesses. You don't want to put this on so thick that you lose the wash that you put on to begin with. We're just picking out areas that could do with a little bit more shadow, and it just makes the metallics a little bit richer. This is one where it's best to experiment a little bit. Use a fairly light touch until you're comfortable with it, and once you get the hang of it, you'll find that you're very confident about where you put these particular shadows in. Don't worry about getting full coverage either. It's fine if this is a little bit patchy and a little bit streaky. That will actually add to the end result on this. And there we go. You can see how it gives the metal some sort of variation. Makes it feel a bit more believable. Stormhost Silver next. This is a very bright silver. With this one, we're highlighting the very points and edges and really accentuating that knotwork that's on there. So the idea here is to make it look like the details are deeper than they really are, and make the light that's on the item catch these details a bit more strongly. This will also give a higher level of contrast with the other colours that you've put on before, and that will help with the illusion of making this look like it's deeper carved and the pattern is, you know, more involved than it really is. You don't have to do every single edge here, just the areas where it looks like it would benefit from it. Again, it's one of those things where if you go in with a fairly light touch to begin with and just add more paint as you feel it's needed, and you'll get the feel of it as you go along. You'll reach a point where it's just, it feels right, it looks how you want it. As you can see, you can start to get that contrast between the different colours that we've used on here, and it's really making the detail work pop out so you can actually see what's happening on there. Back to Agrak's Earthshade for the next bit. This time we're just going for the most recessed areas. So the sort of base layer of the pot, as the sculpt suggests, and then the edges where the knotwork crosses over. And what we're looking to do here is use the strength of the wash in that it will find out all the details that you're trying to show up here, but it's not going to flatten out all of the shading and highlighting that we've just put in. The added bonus of doing this is it gives a little bit more contrast between the pot and the details carved onto it, and it just makes the gold a little bit richer, but we're still on a slightly different hue palette to the gold on the dragon, so the pot's going to stand out as its own thing, without fighting against the details and the colour scheme on the dragon itself. This is another one of those things that as you go along you'll find your own style and your own preferences for what you want a piece to look like. And I will say at this point that a lot of my painting style looks better in person than it does on the camera, and that's all to do with lighting. I paint under natural light a lot of the time, and my painting isn't designed for studio lighting and photographs. So it can look a little bit washed out and it can look a little bit flat on the video, but in person it looks quite nice. And bear that in mind with your own painting too. You're not really painting for other people, you're painting for yourself. And if you like what you've got in your hand when you're working on it and when you've finished it, that's all that really matters. By all means, strive to be a better painter. But it's not the end of the world if a stranger on the internet tells you that they don't like the way you've done something. It doesn't really matter. There's no right or wrong way to do any of this. We now leave that to dry, and it's already looking a lot better than it was. It already makes those details pop out very nicely. Back to the scales, and we're using Evil Sun's Scarlet. This is a fantastic red. I know I say that a lot with these Citadel paints, but they really are very good. And a lot of the colours they've got are really very good. We're going to be using a dry brush again. You have to be a little bit more careful on this one because of course we don't want it on the pot and we don't want it on the gold scales. So just take your time, and a very light touch is needed here, and let the brush do most of the work for you. This particular coat of the dry brushing, you want to cover most surfaces, but don't press the brush in. You just want the brush to go over the top of the scales. You can see here how the folds and details on the face are starting to be more obvious as this bright red goes on. You can go back and do multiple coats to get it the brightness that you want it to be. The important thing is that you don't make the surface completely uniform with this bright red. That's all of the body done. The tail was a little bit trickier. You can see where I've gone over onto the gold a little bit there. That's not really a problem because we're going to be highlighting that area anyway. So where the red's gone, we're going to get some gold. You can see all of his details, all the little creases and folds are all showing up well. Troll Slayer Orange next. Coverage on this one could be better. It's a little bit transparent, but as long as you take your time, it's okay. We're dry brushing here, so it's not that much of an issue that this is a lighter sort of a paint. Switching to a different dry brush for this, I need a little bit more control. So I'm using a Citadel dry brush. This is just one of the small flat ones that they've got. This will allow you to get in a bit easier between your paint colours that you've got, and you want to focus on the highest points. It does look a bit like I'm brushing over everything, but when I'm actually touching the model, I'm only hitting those very high points like the cheek, the lower eyelid, the edge of the nostrils, and they're the areas that you want. You're going to have to go over a few times with this paint just to get it to be visible, so don't try and do it in one heavy coat. It's always best to go over an area and then move on to your next one and come back to that first area that you did, and you can assess then as the paint's dried whether or not you need to put a little bit more on and where you need to put it. Again, it's a process where you will figure it out as you do it, and dry brushing is incredibly forgiving. Fire Dragon Bright next. For the colours here, I wanted to keep quite a warm palette to the red, so I've decided to go up through oranges rather than up through pinks, because that will help keep everything a lot brighter and a lot more in tune with what I want the end result to be. As before, we're going for the very, very high points, and you're doing very little on this layer. You're just catching the sort of the very spots where you'll see the reflection. Now for the gold, we're using Auric Armour. This is a very bright, very warm gold. That's going to work well with that base mirror gold paint that we used and the Agrax Earthshade wash, which is a brown wash. This should help complement those and lift that up and make it look rich as well. Dry brushing again on this one. You can dry brush with metallics. I have had people tell me that you can't, but they're wrong. You very clearly can. Because of the way this model's sculpted, there isn't a lot of point in doing very fine blending and, you know, a high level paint job on it, because it's not really sculpted with that in mind. Different models are sculpted in different ways, and these are designed to be very quickly dry brushed and knocked out. That's just the nature of these sort of resin ornaments. So I'm embracing that. The details on it are fairly coarse and chunky, and that makes our life easier. You can just see on the edge of the pot there where I've caught the gold on the pot with the red dry brushing. After we've dry brushed all the gold, you can see how much warmer that gold's now become. And the overpaint on the tail spikes is gone now. I've dry brushed over that, so that's tidied that up nicely. Stormhost Silver for our next highlight. Similar to what we did on the pot body, we're just going to do the high points, but I'm going to use a dry brush here rather than a standard paintbrush. It's going to give me a slightly streakier finish than if I used a regular paintbrush. I don't really want a smooth finish here. I want this to sort of have a bit of a glitter and a bit of a shimmer to it. And this is kind of the best way of doing that. It's also a lot quicker, so it's great if you're lazy. There's absolutely no shame in being a lazy painter, by the way. You're doing this for fun. Why turn it into work? One nice thing with dragons as well, when you're dry brushing metallics, if a tiny bit goes on the red, it doesn't matter. It's magical, so it's probably going to be a bit sparkly all over. So you can pretend like you meant to do that. Little tiny bit of dry brushing on the eyes, this will be useful later. Right, we'll set this aside to dry, and then we'll do the last few little bits and pieces. Screaming Skull. I'm pretty sure this is just a new version of what used to be bleached bone. I like this colour, but I don't like the fact it goes a bit chalky in the bottle sometimes, so it can be a bit of a nuisance on that front. This is for the teeth. Regular paintbrush this time, and just be careful as you do it, because you do want to try and avoid your existing painted areas that you've finished. Usually takes a couple of coats to do this, but it does dry quite quickly. Now we've done the teeth in the base colour, you want XV88. Little bit of wet blending on the teeth here, so apply some of the XV88 at the root, and before that's dried, you want to pick up a little bit of the Screaming Skull and just very carefully blend that in. You don't need to use a lot of paint for this. You just need a very small drop. And if you find that you've got too much paint on there, wash your brush off and just use your damp brush to just blend things a little bit easier. There's usually a little bit of back and forth as well as you figure out what finish you want. Just make sure that your coats of paint when you do this are fairly light, and then if it's not quite what you want, you're not going to be building up too much paint on the surface. To highlight, we're using White Scar. The coverage on this paint is excellent, but the chalkiness is terrible. All you really need here is just a quick line on the highest spot on the tooth. Waystone Green. This is a technical paint, which means you don't really need to do very much. You just rely on what's underneath. And I really love using these technical paints over metallic bases. Because of the way these eyes are carved, it's going to give a lot of the work that you'd normally put in to make the pupil look right and the eyes stand out. It's going to do all of that for you. You don't want it to be a completely thick, heavy coat over the whole thing. So start with a very light coat to give a uniform coverage, and then just apply it thicker around the edges, leaving the middle of the eye just lightly covered. The paint will level out a little bit as it dries, but this does a lot of the shading and highlighting, but you also get the light effect of the metallics coming through from underneath, and it just It's very vibrant. It's a very fun way of doing these sorts of details. It's now time to use some rhinox hide. This is a great colour to use in conjunction with purples and reds, and since we've got a colour that is in that sort of spectrum, it's brilliant for doing the shaded areas like in the nostrils here for this sort of a project. It's slightly better to use a very dark colour than it is to use black. Black can be a little bit too harsh against the rest of your details, whereas a dark brown or whatever colour you happen to be using on the model can really help create convincing shadows rather than cartoon shadows. Just going through the very deepest areas, so using it to make the teeth pop out a little bit more in contrast, using it to just fill in the jawline there for the lips, so we've got a good barrier between the red and the gold. It's always worth spending a little bit more time on whatever the face is of the thing that you're painting, because human beings naturally look for the face in things. So if you've spent just a little bit more time there with finer details like this, it can just make the whole paint job look better than it really is. I'm also going to go over some of the scale overlaps. I noticed as I was turning the model around that some of the gold just seemed a little bit flat in places. This is one of those things where it's personal taste. You may find that you don't need to do this. You may find you do more than I'm doing here, but it's just very, very quickly, simple lines, just pulling out some of the deeper details on the model. Once I'd let everything dry, I masked off the outside because I needed to paint the inside of the pot. I'm choosing the dregs of a can of, I think it's Volkswagen Mars Red I'm using here. And I'm being quite heavy, just really spraying a lot of paint in there. It doesn't really matter if it runs or sags or anything like that. I just want to make sure there's a good amount of paint inside this pot. Once the red's done, we go back to that mirror gold, and I'm being much lighter with this. I just want a fairly light dusting at the top. Some of that will fall down to the bottom of the pot. This will just help blend the top of the pot when we take the masking off, and it just gives it a slightly nicer finish. The funny thing is, you won't really see the inside of the pot when it's in use, but every now and then you'll see it through the paintbrushes, and it would annoy me if this wasn't finished. The last thing I did was give it a coat of the satin varnish just to seal everything in. It was Rover Flame Red that I used. These were the paints that I used for the inside of the pot. I guess it's time to move on to the reveal. There we go, one finished dragon. Gave it a coat of satin varnish to seal everything in and protect the edges from any future knocks and bumps. If you've got a little ornament or a little pot like this, have a go at painting it. It's a great way to get yourself into miniature painting without the fear of doing it wrong or wasting money or any of that nonsense. I like the end result. I hope you do too. And hopefully I will see you in the future. We have videos here every Tuesday. Sometimes it's cars, sometimes it's crafts. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out, and thanks for spending some time here to see how we did this one.